Well, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar titled Know Your Why, the debate between external and internal load monitoring. My name is Benjamin Jensen. I direct Firstbeat Sports and Research Division for North America, and I'll be your host for today's event. We're planning on having about an hour-long webinar. We'll have the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session. If you do have any questions, please write them in the chat box, and we'll try to get to them in the Q&A session. And if you can, please double check that your mic and video are turned off. Now I'm happy to introduce today's presenter, Firstbeat's own James Wagenschutz. Currently, James splits his time between handling support for Firstbeat Sports key accounts in the US and working with the academy teams at Colorado Rapids. He's involved in data analysis, daily monitoring, managing strength and conditioning programming, and training periodization in collaboration with the coaches. James has previous stops with the Philadelphia Union, U.S. Soccer Federation, FC Boulder, Regis University, Colorado College, and he also holds a master's degree in sports medicine, strength and conditioning, and is NSCA certified strength and conditioning specialist. So James, good to have you here. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for having me.
Great. Now, before we get started, I just had to clear up one thing. When you were on your way to Firstbeat headquarters, we were making bets on how to pronounce your last name. So just for the record, can I hear you pronounce your own last name, please?
Yeah, the American way to say it would be Wagenschutz, but if you were in Germany, it'd be more Wagenschutz.
Okay, that's the exact debate we had with my German and Austrian colleagues here, so I'm glad we got that cleared up.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, well, again, good to have you here. I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you.
All right, awesome. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, the opportunity. So when thinking about external and internal load monitoring, there's a lot of conversations all around the world all the time about what should we use and how often should we use it and when should we use it, or do we even need to use it at all? And so I thought it'd be kind of interesting to think about drumming up some conversation, more so for you to walk away with today, to think about if we are going to monitor load and how do we do it, but maybe ask maybe a few more questions around your process, and not really get into a debate, but more so just to spark conversation within your own environment about maybe what's best for who you're working with. So just want to start off by just thanking everybody along the way that I've had an opportunity to work with. I've been really fortunate to learn from a lot of people, and I wouldn't be able to be here today without having the opportunity with some of my experiences. The folks along the way have really kind of shaped who I've become and the work that I do. Specifically starting out in my master's program and then getting an internship at the USOC, and really just kind of opening up my eyes working with elite athletes. It's been a fantastic journey, and I hope it continues. But I just want to reach out and thank all those folks along the way. Just like everyone on the call, I'm sure you've had somebody influence you along the way or shape your thoughts or provide new ideas. And that's really what my hope is today. And if you think about an old proverb, 1,000 teachers and 1,000 methods, and when we think about external or internal load monitoring, there really are a lot of different ways to skin a cat here. And you need to think about what's going to be working for you and for your environment. Commonly, we think about load monitoring because we want to train for the worst case scenario. Okay, what's the worst thing that can happen? And in my experience, I work primarily in soccer, or around the world it's football. And this is a picture of a team that we took to Europe in 2012. It was a university team, and we set out to do kind of a college tour of playing a handful of matches around different countries, friendly matches, sightseeing, et cetera, which is kind of a common thing for a lot of American teams to do. And when I reflected upon this trip in 2012, it was for the European Championships held in the Ukraine. Because that was kind of the highlight of the trip, was to be able to make our way there to see Germany versus Denmark. There's kind of two things that kind of happen on this trip that really are the worst case scenario. And one of the things is that these guys ended up playing 9 matches in 19 days, which is a ton of different games, right? And we went with a big squad. A lot of players came. And along the way, guys started getting banged up, getting injured. You know, a lot of soft tissue stuff, just really kind of fatigued because of all the travel, and then expected to travel to a new country and meet new people and then play a game that evening. And when I think about that, I think about like also the Premier League fixtures around the holidays where there's congestion, and basically they've got to play 3 or 4 matches within a 7-10 day period. And it's really not optimal, right? And so we're always trying to think about ways in which we can plan for the worst case scenario. Thankfully, this group walked out pretty much unscathed as far as significant injuries, but there were a lot of sore bodies and a lot of potential setting up for future injuries. And the other thing that kind of happened on this trip was I had my appendix taken out in Slovakia. And I don't think anybody can kind of prepare for an injury that just kind of comes on you. That's a longer story, probably perhaps for another webinar, but we never really plan for when things are going to go wrong. But we want to try and prepare as much as we can for when things potentially might have to hit the rubber hits the road where it's really tough. And so taking that experience in 2012, I ended up working with a youth team in 2013. And one of the things I really thought about that trip was, okay, how am I going to instill some habits for our players? How are they going to know what does the worst case scenario look like? What does it look like to compete in multiple games in a weekend? How are they going to be trained and prepared to handle the load of playing multiple matches in a short amount of time? And one of the things that they can do, because we all know that if we're only with them a couple hours out of the day, we're talking 20 to 22 hours where they're not available. So really a lot of the load management happens when they're not with us. And so I think it's really important that you start to teach and instill habits for your players or athletes, or if you're working in individual sports, for just the short, small group you have. And so one of the things I really thought about and had an opportunity to work with this group for over a year and a half was, what can they do away from the field? And so we started teaching them how to take their resting heart rate in the morning when they would wake up. And then I would teach them how to take their heart rate during training. So if we were doing a small-sided game, or if we were doing a conditioning exercise. Now that's all palpation through the neck or through the wrist. And it may not be 100% accurate, but it was about the habit of recognizing that these guys could really learn from what their resting heart rate would be. What would affect the things when they wake up in the morning? Were they stressed out? Did they not sleep well? Things of that nature. Of course, we talked about a lot of other things: nutrition, family, friends, putting the phones down at night, etc. But really, we were just talking about small little habits that you can teach your players along the way. And thankfully, the team did fairly well. This is a photograph of them competing in a state championship after we get into the finals. And along the way, I started thinking about nature and how trees and things that we find in the world, like animals, that we all have various physiological needs and various clues that nature leaves for us. And if we start thinking about the clues of teaching habits to players, or the clues of the relationship among players and among staff, there start to be clues that you pick up where you go. And when I think about some of the experiences I've had, there's certain clues that every place kind of leaves and drops, and you kind of fill your tool belt with different types of clues and to help you along the way. But ultimately, we start to go back toward simplicity. And if we can start thinking about what's simple, nothing's really simple. But at the same time, when you start to look at working in an elite environment, you start gathering data, and then all of a sudden it becomes complex. Well, how do we make it simple that we have to communicate among our staff? Because if we make it complicated and complex for our staff, they're not going to be able to understand what we want to do with the data that we're acquiring. And are we just geared toward performance, or are we also looking at health and safety? And so when we think about health and safety, we're thinking about health and safety of our athletes, the players we're working with. And we need to make it simple enough that everybody understands what information we have, how to disseminate it, and how to communicate it amongst who we're working with. And I think simplicity is best. That also means that that there's a lot of information that you can still have, but it doesn't mean that you need to give everything all at once, or that maybe certain priorities take precedent over other things. So I think it's really important to understand kind of your lens. And for me, this really golden circle of the why, how, and what that Simon Sinek talked about with Start With Why really resonated with me along my journey. And I started thinking about, okay, if I've got these simple experiences and this data, what am I going to do? What's the purpose? What's my purpose as a coach? What's my purpose of giving you information? What's the purpose of sharing the information? So we need to think about why. Why do we do what we do? And how do you do what you do? And that's going to be more the strategy. So the why is going to be your purpose or the principle, kind of a foundational element. And then the how you do what you do is going to be looking at all the different types of load monitoring devices that are available, or opportunities or routes. And then what do you do? Then what do you do with it? So now that you've got it, what do you do with it? So that's going to kind of guide our journey for the next little bit along this conversation. So why use internal or external load, right? That's got to be a real clear understanding from why you're doing it all the time, going back to why. And then how do you filter and communicate it, right? And there's some strategies there, and we're going to talk about some of those ideas. But really just thinking about how you're going to filter it out, what's relevant, and then how you're going to communicate it. And then what is it that you're really going to communicate? So there's a difference there between how we're going to communicate and then what you're going to communicate. And that's the technique. So that's going to be the angle that we're going to talk about today, is the principle, strategy, and technique of external and internal loading. So for me, my why is to serve coaches and athletes along their sporting journey. And that's a real broad statement, but it really speaks to the heart of what I'm all about, is serving other people and trying to help other people be their best, help other people get where they want to be. And I think it's important that along the way, I didn't know that. It took me a long time to kind of figure out my why, because for like a lot of people and practitioners starting out, maybe I took a job that I didn't want right away, but I knew that it might help me climb a ladder or get a director position, or work with a top team along the way. And I was really ego focused and really driven selfishly. And I didn't know along the way that really what I was trying to do was put myself in a position to better understand their needs to help them, ultimately helping me. If you think about the old Jerry Maguire quote, help me help you, it seems kind of funny, but it really does strike a chord, I think, with a lot of us in our profession, of when we're communicating with a head coach, just tell me what we're doing today and I can help you figure out how we're going to manage this load. And then, you come across a few people along the way that are pretty influential. Ray Dalio speaks to that. He's the owner of the world's largest hedge fund. And he wrote a book called Principles, and you can look it up on YouTube. He's got kind of an 8-part miniseries that's about 30 minutes long on principles. And he talks about the ways of successfully dealing with reality to get what you want out of life. And I think there's a couple ideas here. One is you need to think for yourself about what is true. And we're going to talk about that when we specifically talk about data, and we start looking at the data that comes out of using different load monitoring devices. What is true? What is true about the information you get? And then what do you need to know relative to what you need to know? So what do you know relative to what you need to know? And I think that's really important, is that it's context dependent, right? Really understanding your context. And then what questions do you want to answer? And I think that as a kind of an applied sports scientist, and always scratching our head, is trying to figure out what question do I want to answer today? What method do we want to come up with? What do we want to answer today to try and help problem solve or push our athletes or coaches toward being better? But these are really simple ideas that continue to come up in all facets of the work that I do. And the last thing is you got to decide what to do and have the courage to do it. You can't sit on the fence. And when you work in an elite sporting environment, especially at the top end, it's really about results and about winning, and you can't hesitate. So it's about having the confidence to be able to walk into a room and say what you want to say with the confidence of the data and the confidence of what you believe in. You just got to have the courage to do it. And with that, it's ultimately about improving decision-making and interventions. And Dave Tenney said that at the Seattle Sports Science Conference 2015, and it just stuck. It just stuck with me. And now it's carried with everything I've done. I just think about how can we improve the decisions we're making, and how can we improve the interventions. So the interventions might be changing where where we're located on the field, or it might be a different modality that we're using today to get a certain physiological response. But we're improving all the time, looking for ways and not sitting complacent. So when we think about strategy of external and internal load monitoring, we got to think about, well, what are we going to use, and how are we going to do it? How are we going to filter out what it is that we want to communicate? And you have to think of yourself as a practitioner as a Swiss Army knife. You got to think of yourself as different. I've got a different tool for a different day. I've got a different modality for heading into a match, or if it's match day -3, we're going to whip out the scissors. You got to start thinking about yourself as having a broad tool belt to be able to utilize. So getting into the weeds a little bit, external load defined by Wallace and Coates, defined as the work completed by the athlete measured independently of his or her internal characteristics. So I think that's pretty straightforward, and most of you probably already familiar. And then internal load, the relative physiological and psychological stress imposed on the athlete by Helsland. So those are the two kind of definitions when we think about external and internal load monitoring. But it really is based upon the overall scientific principles. And I think anyone on the call today and your background, when we think about these things, specificity, progression, overload, adaptation, recovery, reversibility, and individuality, these are things that are true no matter what environment you're in. So when I was working with a club team or a college team, or when I was learning things at the USOC and we were specifically training a power lifter preparing for an Olympics, it was all about the individual. And your team is made up of individuals, and so how do you get them to be working together? But we really want to start thinking about making sure that we don't lose track of these things along the way. We can easily go down a rabbit hole of certain metrics, but these are the scientific principles that we keep coming back to. And for me, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the individual. Because we know, especially in my background, where I've spent the most of my time kind of working in the elite youth environment, so the 16 to 22-year-old, 16 to 23-year-old transitioning into a professional environment, we know that they come with a lot of different inherent qualities. We know that they come to the table possessing different things, and we really need to pay attention to that. So with an influx of technology, and Darren Burgess showed this earlier this spring in a webinar, and I thought this was a great visual capture of, there's so many different things that we can look at when we talk about external and internal monitoring. And now we're getting to the point now where a lot of things are done via video, but we want to spend a little bit of time talking about GPS and heart rate. I think those are kind of the two big fish out there, and just kind of comparing some of those things regarding how you're going to manage your load. So there's a lot of smart people out there, a lot smarter than me, that know if stuff is valid and reliable. And there's validity and reliability, papers and journals all the time. And we're not going to go into too much of that, because I think, like I said, there's other people out there who've kind of figured that stuff out. But really, for me, on the practical side, when I'm in my environment, is it usable? Can we use it to communicate based upon our why? So that's where we're going to think about it. And one of the common things that we want to look at is running, because at least in soccer or football, we got to run. And I was really turned on to this many years ago about high-speed running and the need to be able to track the speeds and the distance covered of all the players that are running. And what I didn't know was how to program it very well. And I started learning that over time, and I had some good mentors along the way. And then it started to become, okay, now we've got data to track all the running. Well, what do we do with the data? So as you can see, there's a graph that we've all had at some point or along the way. If we've used GPS, they start giving us these data numbers, right? And you start thinking, man, that's a lot of data. And if you're good with filtering out data and thinking about your strategy, what filter do you want to look through this lens? Do you want to look at their average speed? Do you want to look at their top speed? Do you want to look at their resistance to fatigue? And so how many reps they're able to do at the same pace? And doesn't matter by position. So you have to start to filter out what matters to you in your context. I think that's a really key point. So now you've got all this data, how do you filter it out? And the same thing could be said for all the total distance or work rate, accels and decels. Um, is it useful for you? And I think that it's really only useful if you're able to build a relationship and communicate with the coach and the environment you're in. Otherwise, they're numbers that just kind of sit on a desktop or sit in a computer or sit on a spreadsheet. Because how many times as a practitioner have you handed a coach a report and it's ended up in the trash? Or they've looked at it, but they don't understand what they're looking at. So have you taken the time to sit down and share it with a coach and say, well, yeah, this is what total distance means. This is what the amount of accels or decels means for this athlete. But specifically thinking about the individual. And I think it's important you start to highlight and look at the individual numbers and compare individuals to individuals. I'll say that again. It's really important you start to compare individuals to individuals and where they're at in their journey. And like I said, I've primarily worked with like the 16 to 23-year-olds, so there's going to be inherent changes. But these are also young athletes that are playing against 16-year-olds playing against 23-year-olds. And so they need to know that there is a higher benchmark for them out there. There is perhaps a ways to go for them. And I think that will continue to help motivate athletes. But the ability to use pertinent information to communicate specifically with a coach or with a player is where the real gold lies. So you have all this GPS data, and then, I mean, Darren, if you're on the call, or I hope you don't mind me using this, but he presented this later on, which when he was at Arsenal, they did a relationship study between all their training and all their matches at Arsenal, and they found there was no relationship between training GPS and match GPS. So even though they were training for the worst case scenario and training for playing a lot of different matches in a short amount of time, there was still no relationship there, which really was fascinating to think about. So are we doing 10%? Is that enough? Or is it not enough? Or does it even matter? That's where the context really comes into play. And I think along the way, we forget that as human beings that we're dealing with, we are dealing with human beings who participate in a sport. They've got the central nervous system and endocrine systems that just are always functioning. Specifically, the central nervous system, if you think about our inherent design to protect ourselves, you've got to start thinking about this stuff always going on all the time. And if we're fatigued, we're going to be fatigued. But if we're in a calm, rested state, then maybe we've got more to give. And so when you think about that, this graph down here, when we talk about the training process, really internal load drives the training outcome. So we've got this external training load. Okay, we know we need to run 1,000 meters today. What's the quality of that 1,000 meters going to look like today? How are we going to organize it? We're going to run it in groups of 3 or 4. Okay, now we match that with a team. Okay, we've got 18 players perhaps. They're all going to respond slightly different. And so how they respond to that external load, that external stimulus of 1,000 meters, is really where you start to understand how they're going to be able to progress in their environment and how they're going to progress in their sport. But ultimately, that it's kind of like the stopgap. Like, yeah, we're going to run 1,000 meters and it's going to be awesome and the guys are going to get a lot out of it. But then you look around and go, wow, he's bent over, he's on the ground. Wow, that person's really fresh. What do those responses mean, and how did we get there? So another way to look at it is this training graph, which many of you've all seen, different workloads and different parameters along the way, where we've got these highs and lows of valleys of training loads. And we think about, okay, so one day, if you look at Wednesday the 6th, maybe there was a really high training load, and then the next day is off. So maybe the Wednesday the 6th was a match, and the next day was off, and then the 8th was a recovery day, and then on the 9th we start looking at the conditioning again. So it starts to look like a similar graph and trend over time. And I think this really allows you as a practitioner to communicate with your head coach or with a player about the ups and downs of trainings and when you want to peak. It's really a nice, simple way to look at it. And another way to look at it is digging into some of the meat and potatoes specifically of each individual player. Wow, we spent most of the time in our anaerobic threshold zone. So here we are in 80% and 85%. And is that what it is for the match? Is that what it is for our training? Is that what we need to elicit to prepare for the worst case scenario? Or are we not in that situation where we don't need to train for the worst case scenario, but we want to make sure that if we're doing this 4v4 activity, or if we're running 1,000 meters, that we're really hitting certain benchmarks. And so that's the neat thing about internal training, is it gives you this kind of response. And this internal training load monitoring, you can really look at it and say, yeah, okay, they are responding appropriately to the training stimulus we're giving them. Or perhaps maybe there's something we need to look at because they're not able to recover. And so now we've got to dive a little bit deeper. And so now we go back to that original principle question: what do I need to know relative to my environment? So when we look at some of these other graphics and some of these other options here, are these useful? Is that useful? Is that last graph useful? If you're talking to a coach maybe for the first time, and you want a place to begin a conversation with, and you want a kind of a targeted number that you want to look at for an athlete. It's okay, this athlete, we want to target a training effect of 3.8 today. All right, so how do we get there? Well, as we all know, it's a lot of different factors go into it, but it allows a starting point of communication with a coach. And one of the things that I think a lot of people and practitioners are familiar with is the acute chronic work rest ratio. And again, Gabbit's put out a lot of information, and there's a lot of people who dispute it, and there's a lot of people who agree with it. But it could be a starting point for you, depending upon your environment. And if it's a starting point that you believe in, and if it's a starting point that you want to use, then how do you track it? And what's a simple way to look at it over time? I think that's really important. And another way to do it now is if you think about where we're at with the current world of being able to train remotely, and not, a lot of things are out of our control right now, but they've always been out of our control. And like I said earlier, you've only got your athletes for maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours a day. So most of the time they're not with you. And so there's a lot of remote training devices now, and a lot of remote training options, which is another way to visually see kind of what your athletes are doing when they're not with you. And there's also a way to capture data live, which we know about and has been used for several years now. But we have to start thinking about the communication you want to give the coach, the communication you want to give a player, and what does that look like? So those are some of the strategies and the hows and the filter, but now it comes back to your context. Okay, so we've got these different tools and ideas. Okay, if we're going to use GPS and we know we want to track their total distance, 1,000 meters, okay, we want to track these certain things. How do we filter that out and visualize and communicate it? But then relative to what your overall context is. And I think it's really simple to say, well, the context of a tennis player is going to be different than a soccer player. And absolutely, different types of metrics we want to look at, and different types of physiological responses that we're going to engage in. So for me, when I think about it, the foundation is player health and safety. Are they available to train? I mean, that for me as a practitioner is the first and foremost. Are they available to train? What did I do to help them be ready to train? What did they do to help themselves be ready to train? So if you think about that youth club team I worked with, and talking about just simple habits, are they available to train? And if they're not, then that's a really cool place to open up a conversation with these athletes. Why aren't you available? What's going on? How's the stress at home? What's your family life like? And then these relationships become so paramount to your ability to connect with them and drive what you want out of them. And then next we start to say, okay, they're available to train. Now let's take a look at the physical capacities of each athlete and how do we individualize it. So if you think about my context in soccer, football, 11v11, right? We know, depending upon the overall style of play, we've got to do and have certain physical characteristics by position. And then we can start to individualize that within our training. So it's not okay to just say, well, we're going to put every player in a 4v4 activity and accept the same individual response. We all know that the grid size, the location on the field, the dimensions, the work to rest ratios, all that's going to play a role in how each player is going to respond to the training stimulus. But most importantly, it's about the coach relationship with the players and what the coach is driving through the training exercise. So then we look at the sport demands within that. So we know, okay, if we're going to do this 4v4 activity, we know that we operate at 85, 90% because we want to do high intensity. So we want to make a lot of actions per minute. So we know that they're going to have to do an X amount of accels or decels within that 4v4 activity. Ultimately, then it comes back to the game model. How does that 4v4 activity translate into the 11v11? And that ability to communicate the data along the pipeline from a continuum of 4v4 to an 11v11 game is really, really, really important. So when you think about external load and the strategy you might employ is, okay, same thing, player available. What's their training status? Are they good to go? Or are they feeling a little down? And how are we gonna know what their capacities are? Well, we're gonna test them. Pretty common things to do in our world is do some sort of repeat sprintability, measure their fatigue index or a 30-15 IFT, Martin Bouquet, some sort of 1,000 meters or max aerobic speed. So we can test this and get pretty good data using GPS through an external load. And then within that, you test them and then you get some data, right? So you know, okay, maybe they've run 7K, 450 meters at very high intensity distance. And then we've got a pretty good sprinter on our hands and they can sprint 9.5 meters a second. Even though I'm in America, I still like using meters per second. I think it's important that we are in the metric system here in the US. And then specifically when we think about on a conditioning day, so if you think about the graph where you've got the waves up and down, and your match day -3 or match day -4, and you're a few days out, you can train a little bit above. So it's really kind of nice to be able to see this, but what does it really mean? What does it mean? Because ultimately they need to be able to play the sport. And what does the data mean for a coach? Okay, you didn't hit 7K, but you needed to hit 7K on this day. Does that mean you're not going to start the player? What else was going on with the athlete? And I think that's really why internal load becomes such an important factor. And in my mind becomes the dominant factor when you start to think about, well, why didn't they run 7K? Were they available? Were they feeling good? We know that we might do the same type of testing, but now we're going to do it with their heart rate. So instead of GPS, we're going to look at their heart rate and their heart rate responses. Did they push themselves relative to them? Maybe they've got more in the tank and they could have unleashed it a little bit more. Or maybe that there was something else going on that was stressing them out and their heart rate got high too fast. And then we start to look at some real specific measurements that we can look at. Yeah, they need to hit 85 to 95% max, at a minimum 70% VO2, which we know in the soccer world, and that's where the game is played at. And then specifically looking at something called TRIMP. And many of you are probably familiar with TRIMP or TRIMP per minute. We're going to talk a couple of minutes about that. But that's a nice visual data that says, yep, we hit 7K, we hit TRIMP 3.1. Ultimately, again, within the context of 11v11. So the strategies can be really similar, but the what or the technique can be different. So when you think about the technique and the what, one of the things that you start looking at is the TRIMP per minute, because we really want to make sure that the intensity and the specificity, when we go back and we think about the scientific principles, we want to make sure that those are always at the forefront. So the specificity of that 1,000-meter run or the 4v4 activity or whatever match it is, training exercise you're setting up to prepare for the match or game day or competition, that there's some really specific intention there. All right, and that's where TRIMP can come into play. So TRIMP is essentially training pulse. I think Bannister in '91 might have been one of the first to kind of bring it to the forefront, calculated by heart rate reserve times duration. So when you think about the density of an activity, that 4v4 activity, how many activities you did in a short amount of time, the density of it, right? So we did it for 20 minutes rather than we did it for 60 minutes. So the training load, you might have gotten a training load of 108, which would fit in kind of a moderate scale. But because it was only 45 minutes, it became a 2.3 TRIMP, which might actually be really hard. So the time duration of the intensity of the activity really becomes crucial to understanding how individual players respond within that activity. And so you might have the same 4v4 activity for your group of 18-year-olds or 22-year-olds or whatever environment you're in, and you think they all respond the same. Yeah, they all had a general amount of accels and decels. They all covered 2K. They all ran 5.5 meters a second. But the reality is you might have had two of those players, 2 out of the 8, feel like this was such an intense activity for them that their TRIMP might have been 3.2, 3.4 per minute of that activity. And others within that activity might have only had a TRIMP of 1.8 or 2.1 or 2.3. And you start to individualize the response within that activity. And then that allows you to pull that athlete aside, have a conversation, but also maybe you need to do some extra conditioning and what that might look like. Or you may need to back off. Or they were going to transition into an 8v8 game, but you know what? They look really overloaded. They look really gassed. Maybe they become a neutral player, a joker, a bumper, or something like that. So having this data live and being able to see it live really helps kind of monitor things along the way. This is a great visual graphic of that. When you think about the difference specifically in my environment, when you're thinking about kind of an 18 to 22-year-old, the difference between a freshman coming in and a senior coming on the way out, someone who might be a little bit more conditioned, I think it's really important to start looking at the difference in training load like I just spoke about. So having this data really within the context of your environment helps improve decision making, right? I mean, and that's when we go back to Tinny's comment about improving that decision making and then therefore improving the interventions. And yes, those are real mountains in the background. For those who have never been to Colorado, this is pretty much where I get to work every day. But the relationships with players allow us to drive for performance. And here's a young athlete who was coming back from an injury that he sustained season prior to me coming in. And I got to know this athlete and start working with this athlete. And we just started building a nice friendship and a nice relationship. And we started talking about certain metrics that he needed to hit in order to get back onto the field. You know, his team is playing in the background there. And so here's an athlete who's intrinsically motivated to get better. But at the same time, he's sitting here going, man, what do I need to do? What metrics do I need to hit? How do I do this? And I said, well, we're going to take it one step at a time. We're going to be open about our communication. We're going to open and share things with each other. And he wants to get better. So he's there putting in the work while his team is playing. He's saying, look, I'm going to be there right with them. And that relationship that we built really, really helped drove his performance toward getting back into the team. And he was able to make his return last fall, coming off a significant injury. And it was his first time coming back. And he was able to put in 24 minutes into a match, which was really an awesome thing to see. And he got a big standing ovation and an applause from all of his team and his coaches because it had been a long journey with him. And the relationships we forge in our journey really are what matter. And those ultimately help drive the performance. And those ultimately drive the conversations about the communication, the data you have. So along the way, you need to recognize confirmation bias. What are your beliefs? And do you hang on to those beliefs? Do you hang on to those old ideas? And I think my journey, when I first started out, I was like, man, we gotta lift hard and we gotta run hard. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, you know what? Maybe we're doing too much too early. We gotta back off. And it's really taken a lot of people to help me understand, okay, well, those are just your beliefs. You got to open up the window and see what else is going on out there and try not to hang on to old ideas. And maybe there's a new way to do something. And I think over time, I've come to learn about internal load monitoring and really looking at TRIMP as a huge key metric for me as a new idea to utilize for my training with our athletes. And so it might be a little uncomfortable at first learning something like that, but in the end, it's been so much easier to work with. And, you know, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that whatever environment you're in, if you're using data, you want to make sure it's science-backed You want to make sure that you're answering the questions that you need to know in your environment, and you want to do it with confidence. And you want to be able to communicate it really clearly with everyone on your team, including the players, and then with the coaches. So appreciate the opportunity today, and turn it back over to you, Benjamin.
All right. Thank you, James. Excellent presentation. Yeah, if anybody else has any questions, again, you can throw them up in the chat. So we do have a question related to scaling TRIMP. So for example, if we know that a game matches like a 200 TRIMP, kind of how do you scale to match up to that 200 TRIMP?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the important thing is if you have any kind of historical data, and if you're starting from fresh. And so if you have historical data, that allows you to start to recognize how you want to scale. I mean, and that sounds like a real general answer, but it's important that if you have historical data, you start to identify trends. And if you want to scale it, I think one of the ways you have to look at it is what's the end game then. So you have historical data on one end, and then what's the end point on the other. So are you 3 days out, 4 days out? What I found is when you scale it, sometimes you're going to have big jumps. So like if you go from a recovery day, and you have a TRIMP of maybe like 90, 95, where the next day the conditioning might need to be at 200 or 180. You've got to push it. So if you haven't done that before, you might consider scaling it more like on a 20% or a 25%. That's usually been my guide, is if I don't have the historical data and I haven't done it before and I'm about to bring it in for the first time, I'm going to look at like 20-25% scale.
Okay, and kind of on that same note, how do you handle it? Obviously, it's a lot easier if you have that game data to kind of
Yeah.
gauge your practices. How do you get around those situations where, I know with some of the pro levels, you may not have been legally able to get that game data. So how have you been able to balance not having in some situations that game data, those game loads?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because if you don't have the data live, or if you're not able to, based upon professional leagues, they're not allow the information to be put on athletes while they're training. There's the feel of a coach too. If you think about that, if depending upon your environment, I would say that if there's enough resources, that you probably have to dig in and look outside of your sport, or reach out to colleagues, the colleagues who may have that data. But when you don't have the data to work with, then it becomes really difficult. But what you can do is you can start to assess individually other metrics that you can in training. But at the end of the day, we all, like I was kind of sharing, that slide about Darren with Arsenal. He's like, hey man, we've got all this data. We know what the game data is. We're going to train for it, but it never really influenced it. So at the end of the day, you're using as much science and data as you can. The reality is if you don't have exact data, it becomes difficult to make that target.
Okay. Another question came in. This is interesting. So why is it an either or with external versus internal? Wouldn't you want to know what the association is between the two and whether it changes due to fatigue, improved work capacity, etc.?
Yeah, no, if you're able to do it, I think it's amazing. I know that not everybody has the resources out there to have both. But if you can have both and mirror both, then I think you can improve decision making.
Okay, another one, and this is pretty detailed. So on one slide, it showed you had 650 as the best load for 7 days.
Yeah, that was just an example. It was just an example optimal load. Don't take that as exact.
Okay, okay, good to know. And again, what is your opinion of SRPE, and kind of how do you see it fitting in with other metrics?
I'm sorry, say that again. SRPP?
SRPE.
Oh, SRPE. I got it. Yeah. So when you think about differential RPE and fitting it in, I think one of the things that you have to do is understand is what's the ability of a player or an athlete to be able to understand their own RPE. I think we've known, and it's been widely used, the subjective data, the RPE scale. I think it's a great baseline. The differential RPE becomes really interesting because then it starts to filter out some of the noise. And that goes back to kind of the validity and reliability of what you're using. The differential allows for a lot greater separation, which makes your data a bit more accurate over time.
Okay, another question came in. So over your career, what systems have you used as far as gathering sports science data?
Oh man, I'm still fairly young in the game, but it seems like I've tried and tested a lot of different things. And part of that is because people are willing to give you some demo stuff to test, and so I mean I've tested heart rate monitors, I've tested stuff on footwear, different types of GPS units, accelerometers. We even started looking recently when I was at the Philadelphia Union, EMG. There's a lot of different stuff on the market, and I think what you said, you start to have to kind of filter through. Okay, what's my end game here? How do I want to communicate what it is I'm trying to gather? Okay, what it is I'm trying to gather. What's the best tool to help me do that? Okay, who's got the most time in that domain? So if you look at something like Firstbeat and you think about, okay, they've been around for 20 plus years. We've got really good science to back what we're doing. Yeah, it's a really good tool to use. And so those are the things that you want to start to filter through when you're asking your questions about what do I want to use and how am I going to use it and why am I using it?
Okay. Another question came in. So have you experienced much resistance from players with regard to the internal load monitoring? For example, they just do it, or do they just do it, or is it mandatory for the athletes to wear it?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It can be tricky depending upon your environment. I think there's a cultural aspect that's really important that you respect, and it depends upon your culture and the environment. As the coach said, it's a top-down approach, or as the coach taking the time to build the relationships with players so they've earned trust to say, this is how it's going to help you become a better athlete. And not every athlete can buy in. I've seen pro athletes take a GPS unit and dump it in the trash on the way out to training. And I've seen the same thing. I've seen the same thing with a heart rate monitor. Halfway through it gets a little uncomfortable if the strap isn't right, and they just rip it off and keep going. So it really depends upon your culture and your environment as to how to create the buy-in.
Okay, excellent. Great. Well, I think that's all the questions that we had for today and all the time. And so once again, James, thanks for being here today. And we will have this recording available for everybody who attended or who wasn't able to attend. And again, thank you to all the attendees for stopping by.
Thanks, Benjamin. Thanks, everyone.